By 12 o'clock today, my son's Boston investment firm was hit with a federal fraud lawsuit, and his $400,000 deal was completely dead. He stood in the freezing mud of my dock, shivering in his wetsuit, realizing that a $75 paper pawn receipt had just ruined his career. 5 minutes ago, he thought he was walking away with my life's work. He forgot that on the coast of Maine, a fancy Boston suit doesn't mean a thing if you don't know how the tide works. To understand how we ended up on that foggy dock, you have to go back 1 month. My name is Walter Vance. I spent 45 years building and restoring wooden lobster boats along the freezing shoreline of Casco Bay. My shoulders are stiff from swinging iron adzes, and my palms have scars that 60 years of salt water couldn't wash clean. My wife, Clara, passed away 6 years ago. Our only son, Julian, works as a senior financial advisor for a corporate firm in Boston. Julian drives a black luxury sports car, wears hand-tailored suits, and married Evelyn, a woman who thinks milk comes from a plastic bottle and wood comes from a store. I paid for Julian's private prep school. I paid off his 4-year degree at Tufts University. And I built the 2-story cedar home sitting right on the harbor water where he grew up. 1 month ago, I was admitted to the hospital with a severe lung infection from inhaling cold winter dampness. While I was laying in that yellow hospital room, hooked up to an IV line, Julian and Evelyn went to work. They used an old healthcare proxy form to claim I was no longer capable of managing my affairs. They packed up my personal belongings into cardboard boxes. They took my father's 1944 brass Coast Guard compass, the only thing I had left of him, and pawned it for $75. And then Julian signed a 30-year commercial lease, turning my historic wooden boatyard into a private deep-water dock for a Boston luxury yacht club. When I was discharged from the hospital on a freezing Thursday afternoon, I didn't get a ride from my son. I took a city bus back to the harbor, dragging my leather duffel bag through the slush. When I reached the wooden gate of my boatyard, a heavy steel chain was wrapped around the posts. A printed plastic sign read, "Private Property, Future Home of Casco Bay Marina." Julian was standing on the dock wearing a long wool coat, talking on his cell phone to a contractor. I walked up to the iron chain, leaning on my wooden cane. "You lease the yard, Julian?" I asked, my voice rasping from the lung infection. Julian hung up his phone and stepped over to the fence, looking uncomfortable. "It's a long-term commercial lease, Dad," Julian said, his voice flat and professional. "The boatyard hasn't made a real profit in 5 years. This lease guarantees $80,000 a year in passive income. I've already secured you a luxury waterview suite at a senior residence in South Portland. Your bags are already packed in my trunk." I looked at my son. I looked at his polished shoes standing on the cedar planks my hands had laid 30 years ago. I didn't yell. I didn't raise my cane. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out that $75 pawn receipt. "A man who sells his father's compass to buy a carpet in Boston," I said softly to the ocean wind, "is going to find out that when the tide turns, a fancy suit doesn't float." Julian sighed, tapping his foot on the gravel. "Be reasonable, Dad. The lease contract is signed. The deposit check is cleared." I didn't take the ride to South Portland. I walked 4 blocks down the waterfront to a small room above a bait shop owned by my old apprentice, Toby. It cost $300 a month. It smelled like herring salt, wet hemp rope, and diesel exhaust. My lungs burned every time I took a deep breath of the damp fog rolling off the bay. My left hip throbbed from walking on the concrete piers. I lived on canned clam chowder, hard-crust bread, and black tea cooked on a small propane burner. Julian thought he had trapped me. He thought an old boat builder with bad lungs would just sit in a bait shop room and fade away into the fog. He forgot one simple truth. I spent 45 years studying every rock, ledge, and legal boundary in Casco Bay. Julian knew corporate contract law, but he didn't know maritime riparian rights under Maine state law. When I built that boatyard in 1978, I didn't just buy the land. I secured a permanent federal maritime easement for the tidal mudflats extending 200 feet into the channel. Under Maine Maritime Ordinance, a tidal easement cannot be leased or converted to commercial recreational use without an active commercial wooden vessel holding primary registry at the slip. If no wooden vessel is registered, the federal easement defaults back to the state port authority, and any commercial lease built on it becomes completely null and void. Julian had cleared out all my old wooden boats 3 weeks ago. He thought an empty dock looked cleaner for his Boston investors. He had just erased his own legal right to the water. On Friday morning at 9 o'clock, the regional vice president of the Boston Yacht Club arrived at the boatyard in a silver limousine. He was accompanied by 2 corporate lawyers and Julian, who was smiling and holding a leather binder for the official site handover. A heavy construction barge was already idling out in the channel, ready to drive steel pilings into the harbor floor. That's when a 40-foot wooden lobster boat came churning through the morning mist. It was Toby's boat, the Martha V, and standing on the wooden deck was me, wearing my oilskin jacket and rubber boots. Standing beside me was Captain Thomas Miller from the United States Coast Guard, along with the Chief Portland Harbor Master. Toby brought the boat right alongside the main pier. I stepped off onto the dock, my rubber boots making a heavy, wet thud on the cedar planks. Julian stared at me, his face turning pale. "Dad?" Julian stammered, stepping forward. "What are you doing?" "This is a private commercial inspection." Captain Miller stepped up to the Boston vice president and pulled a laminated federal maritime order from his pocket. "Under Title 38 of Maine Revised Statutes," Captain Miller announced, his voice booming over the sound of the diesel engine. "Parcel 7B is an active federal commercial waterway easement. Because the registered property holder, Mr. Walter Vance, has redocked an active commercial wooden vessel at this slip, no construction or private recreational conversion may take place." The vice president turned to Julian, his eyes wide with fury. "What is he talking about?" the executive demanded. "You guaranteed us this water lot was cleared of all commercial encumbrances." "It was cleared!" Julian yelled, his voice cracking with panic. "He doesn't own any boats anymore. He's retired." I reached into my oilskin jacket and pulled out a rolled sheet of heavy parchment paper. I unrolled it right on the hood of the silver limousine. "I don't need to own the boat, Julian," I said calmly. "I own the Master Shipwright Certificate for Casco Bay. As long as a wooden hull built by my hands floats in this water, the federal easement remains active under my name. And Toby's boat was built in my yard in 1989. The vice president looked at the parchment, then looked at Julian with pure disgust. "We've already wired your firm $200,000 in non-refundable development fees," the vice president said, his voice ice cold. "Our legal team will be filing a full recovery lawsuit against your Boston firm for material misrepresentation by 12 o'clock today." The executive turned around, got into his limousine, and slammed the door. The construction barge out in the harbor reversed its engines and slowly backed away into the fog. Julian stood on the dock as his world collapsed around his ears. His suit coat was damp from the salt spray, his hair wild in the sea wind. "Dad!" Julian gasped, his hands shaking violently as he looked at me. "The firm leveraged that $200,000 for my partnership buy-in. If they sue us for fraud, I'll lose my broker license by next week." I walked up to my son. I reached into my pocket, pulled out that $75 pawn receipt, and pressed it firmly into his trembling palm. "Choices have currents, Julian," I said softly, looking him straight in the eyes. "When you throw your father's compass overboard to lighten your load, don't be surprised when you lose your way in the storm." Julian looked down at the paper receipt in his hand. He couldn't speak. He stood there frozen as the limousine drove away, leaving him alone in the freezing rain. 2 weeks later, the heavy steel chain was gone from the front gate. The printed plastic sign was floating somewhere out in the Atlantic Ocean. Toby and I sat on the wooden steps of the shop, drinking hot black coffee out of tin mugs, listening to the tide lap against the cedar pilings. On the wooden workbench behind us sat my father's brass compass, bought back from the pawn shop for $75. Toby took a long sip of his tea, looking out over the gray water of Casco Bay. "What happens if Julian calls you from Boston next week, Walter?" Toby asked. I reached out, picked up the brass compass, feeling the weight of the cold metal against my palm, and set it down next to the shop logbook. "The tide doesn't answer calls from Boston, Toby," I said softly, watching the morning fog lift off the channel. "And neither do I."